Her husband had been gone 6 days before anyone in Heron Flat thought to check on her. She knew this because Mrs. Garvey from the post road came by on the 7th morning, and the woman had the careful look of someone who had been sent, rather than someone who had come of her own accord. She brought a jar of pickled beets and set it on the step and said the weather had been fine. The woman looked past her at the yard, at the fence that leaned, at the gate that was held shut by a loop of baling wire someone had twisted on years ago and never replaced. She thanked Mrs. Garvey for the beets. She did not say that she had already catalogued every problem on this property and ranked them in the order she intended to address them. She did not say she had been up before light each morning since he left, walking the perimeter of the land in the gray cold, learning what she had married into. He had said she would tend the chickens. That was the word he used, tend, as though it were a small thing, a side thing, the sort of work you did with one hand while your attention was elsewhere. He had said it on the train coming west, looking out the window at the flatland opening up, and she had nodded and said nothing. She had looked at his hands, which were large and incapable, and she had thought, he has worked hard. She could see it in him. She did not doubt the man's capacity for effort. What she doubted, though she kept this to herself, was whether he had ever looked at his own land and really seen it. The cabin sat at the low end of a rise, which meant the runoff came toward it in spring rather than away. The foundation on the north side had heaved, and the door frame was out of true. She noticed it the first evening when the door wouldn't latch without lifting it slightly on the handle side. The coop was built of milled lumber that had dried and split in the dry summers, and the gaps were wide enough in places that a weasel could have walked through sideways. There were 11 hens and 1 rooster, and 2 of the hens were already pulling feathers from the others, which meant they were either bored or short on protein, and she suspected both. The garden plot was there, fenced with a single strand of wire that a determined rabbit would not have found challenging. The soil at the edge, where she dug a few inches with her boot heel, was pale and thin, the kind of soil that had been worked without being fed. Whoever had tried to garden here before, and there had been someone, she could see the old furrow lines, had taken without giving back. She made a list in her head, which was where she kept everything. It was a long list. The first week she tended the chickens. She also did everything else. She patched the coop gaps with scraps of lumber she found stacked behind the barn, split shingles and odd pieces that someone had kept without a specific purpose, the way people on the frontier kept things. She mixed the patch cuts with a mud and straw plaster on the worst sections where the lumber was too far gone to hold a nail. She moved the roost bars lower because the ceiling of the coop shed heat upward and the hens were sleeping in cold air. She found that 2 of the feeders had crusted calcium deposits blocking the water flow, which she cleaned with a wire she bent herself from a piece of fencing. She did this methodically, without hurrying, without drama. She wrote him a letter on the 8th day. She told him the hens were laying at a better rate. She told him the north gate latch had been repaired. She told him she had found rot in 2 of the fence posts along the upper pasture line, and she had replaced them with posts she cut from a stand of birch at the property edge, which she knew was not ideal wood for the purpose, but was available and sufficient until proper posts could be sourced. She told him the weather had been cold and clear. She did not tell him that she had spent 3 hours one evening sitting on the step of the cabin looking at the yard and the land beyond it, seeing not what was there but what could be there, the way a person looks at an unmade thing and understands its eventual form. She sealed the letter and walked it to the post road herself. Heron Flat was not a town so much as a decision. A store, a grain elevator, a church that doubled as a meeting hall, a smithy, and 20 or so homesteads scattered across the surrounding land like a hand of cards dealt without attention to arrangement. The nearest actual town was 3 hours by wagon east, longer in mud season. The man at the store was named Corrigan. He had the patient manner of a man who had watched many people pass through and many people stay, and he had developed a neutral expression that could mean almost anything. When she came in the first time to price seed and ask about the soil the older settlers favored, he looked at her for a moment before answering, as if assessing whether her questions were real questions or the kind people asked to have something to say. He told her the soil in the lower parcels ran clay-heavy, and that most people working that ground had better results with root vegetables than with grain. That turnips and potatoes came up reliable where wheat would fail in a dry year. He told her the Halverson family 2 lots over had been putting oats in the low field for years and doing all right. He told her he stocked seed potatoes in late winter. She thanked him and bought what she had come for and walked back the 3 miles with the parcels and the information both. The woman at the next homestead, Mrs. Olson, a wide-shouldered Swede who had been on her land for 11 years, came across the fence line that second week carrying a bundle of dried dill and a question that she wrapped in small talk, but which was essentially, "Who are you, and what do you intend?" She liked Mrs. Olson for the directness under the politeness. She answered both questions honestly. She told her where she was from, a small settlement in Manitoba, nothing much, gone now mostly. She told her she intended to put in a kitchen garden and see about expanding the chicken operation if the first winter went the way she hoped. Mrs. Olson looked at the coop, freshly patched and re-roofed along the east side where the shingles had lifted. She looked at the fence line, the new posts. She said, "You do your own work then." It was not a question. She said, "Yes, Mrs." Olson nodded once, the way a person nods when they file something away as settled, and after that she stopped by regularly. And the small talk became real talk, which was something she had not expected to find so quickly and which she was more grateful for than she said. The first winter came in October. She had been expecting it. She had grown up with winters that came in October, the sky going flat and colorless overnight, the ground hardening from the feet up. What she had not anticipated was the particular quality of cold on the open land, with nothing between the north wind and the yard, but a stand of spruce on the far side of the upper field that was not tall enough or thick enough to do much. The wind came through the yard like it owned it. She insulated the coop with a second interior wall of straw bales on the north and west sides, a method she had seen work in Manitoba and saw no reason would fail here. She ran a lantern inside on the worst nights, the low-heat kind, hung high enough that there was no fire risk. She banked the foundation of the cabin with sod and snow both, packing it tight against the heaved north wall, and this helped with the draft that had been coming through the floorboards in the corner bedroom. The hens kept laying through November, which surprised Corrigan when she came in with eggs to sell. He looked at the 2 dozen sitting on his counter and then at her and said most people lost their production by mid-October. She said she had made some adjustments to the coop. He asked what kind. She told him. He listened with the careful attention of a man writing things down in his head rather than on paper. When she finished, he said, "I'll take all you can bring me." She brought him eggs every 10 days that winter. She kept a ledger in her coat pocket, a small notebook she had bought at the back of the store, and she wrote down every dozen sold, every price per dozen, every purchase made against that income. The numbers were not large, but they were consistent, and consistency was its own kind of wealth. He wrote back in November, a letter that came through Corrigan's when she was there selling eggs, which meant she read it standing at the counter in her coat with her mitts on. He said things were going slowly. He said the work he had gone east to settle was more complicated than expected, tied up in a question of inheritance that required lawyers he couldn't afford and time he was losing. He said he was sorry for the length of it. He said he hoped she was managing. She folded the letter and put it in her coat pocket next to the ledger. She bought seed potatoes, a sack of oats, 2 yards of heavy cotton, and a ball of beeswax cord. She wrote him back that evening. The hens were laying through the winter. She was selling eggs to Corrigan. The cabin was holding the cold well. The upper fence was repaired. She said she hoped his matter resolved itself cleanly. She told him the spruce on the north field edge would need thinning in spring if he wanted light on the oat ground. She did not say she had been lying awake some nights calculating things. Not worrying, she was not, strictly speaking, worried but calculating. What she could bring in before spring, what would need to be spent, what was possible. She had always been more comfortable with a problem she could calculate than one she could only feel. In January, she started sewing. Mrs. Olson had mentioned in passing that she needed new curtains for the front room, that the old ones had gone thin and she hadn't the time to make them up herself. She said this without asking anything of anyone, just noting it in the way people noted winter inconveniences. But she heard it and asked, "What fabric and how long?" Mrs. Olson looked at her for a moment, she told her. She made the curtains over 3 evenings from fabric she had in her trunk, a heavy cream cotton that was left from something she had made herself 2 years ago, and delivered them across the fence and asked a fair price and received it without negotiation because the price was fair. Mrs. Olson told Corrigan's wife. Corrigan's wife told Mrs. Drummond, who lived on the post road. By February, she had 3 more curtain commissions and a request for a quilted lap blanket from an elderly man named Fergus Bright, who lived alone on the east parcel and had hands too stiff in winter to hold a needle. She sewed in the evenings by lamp while the wind worked at the cabin and the hens were quiet in the coop, and the spruce on the far field stood black against the snow. It was not unpleasant work. She had always sewed. She had learned it young, and her hands knew it without needing her full attention, which meant she could think while she worked, which was when she did her best thinking. She added the sewing income to the ledger. She added it in a separate column from the egg money. By March, the 2 columns together were something. Spring came late, the way it always did on the prairies. Not gradually, but in reversals, cold and then briefly warm and then cold again, the land unable to commit. She was ready for it regardless. She had the seed potatoes Corrigan had held for her, a plan for the garden plot, a composted pile she had been building since October from kitchen waste and coop cleanings, and a draft of the fence redesign that would increase the garden area by 1/3. She also had the soil. She had been working the garden plot all winter in the small ways available in winter. Working the compost in when the ground softened briefly in December, working it again in February during a warm week that surprised everyone. In March, she dug the whole bed to a depth of 10 inches and mixed in the last of the compost and a load of aged manure she had arranged to get from the Olson place in exchange for 2 weeks of egg credit. Corrigan, when she came in that spring for additional seed, looked at her hands and then at her face with an expression she couldn't entirely read. He said, "You've been busy." She said she had kept herself occupied. He nodded. He said he had a customer asking about laying hens. A new family coming in from Ontario who wanted to start with a small flock rather than build one. He asked if she would consider selling 4 or 5 pullets at the end of the season when her new hatch came up. She said she would consider it, and what price was he suggesting? He told her. She told him a different price, and they met somewhere between, which was how things worked in Heron Flat. He came back in June. She was in the garden when she heard the wagon on the post road, and she stood up and watched it turn down the track toward the cabin. She recognized the way he sat, upright but tired, the kind of tired that lived in a person's back rather than their face. She took off her gloves and walked to the fence gate. He climbed down and stood in the yard and looked. He looked for a long time. The cabin was the same cabin, same rough timber, same low roof. But the foundation had been rebanked and the door frame was plumb now. She had shimmed it in April. The north wall had a new section of siding where the old boards had gone punky and she'd replaced them. The yard was raked and organized, not pretty but purposeful, the way a working yard looks when someone has thought about it. The coop was tight and clean and the hens were in the yard run, 11 of them and 7 new pullets from the spring hatch. The garden was in, potatoes, turnips, a row of beans, a row of carrots, a second bed of onions that had come up thick and even. He looked at all of it. She waited, he said. "You've been working." She said yes, he said. The coop looked sound. She said she had worked on it some. He turned and looked at the north field. The spruce line had been thinned, 3 trees taken out to open the light. The upper fence was straight and the posts were new. He turned back and looked at the garden again, the rows coming up clean and green. He said he didn't know what to say. She said he didn't have to say anything. But she took the ledger out of her apron pocket. She had moved it there from her coat when the weather turned, and she held it out to him. He took it and opened it. He looked at the columns, the egg sales, the sowing income, the seed costs and supply costs tracked against what came in. He turned the pages slowly. He looked up at her. She said, "I kept an account." He looked back at the ledger. He turned the last page. At the bottom of the final column, she had written a number. It was not a small number. It was enough, in fact, to cover a considerable portion of what she knew. because she had asked Corrigan carefully and without explanation. The land note required in payments over the next year. He closed the ledger and held it without speaking. She said, "The eggs will stay consistent through autumn if the coop stays warm. I know what it needs now. The curtain work has been steady and I expect it will continue. The pullets will be ready to sell in 8 weeks and Corrigan has a buyer." He said, "You did all this," she said. She had kept herself occupied. He stood in the yard holding the ledger with both hands, and the hens moved around the edges of the run, and the garden sat in the afternoon light going green and quiet, and the thinned spruce line on the far field let the sun in at an angle it hadn't come in before. He said he had come back not knowing what he would find. She said she imagined he had. He said he was sorry it had taken so long. She said the time had been useful, and that was most of what passed between them that first evening. They ate together and he asked questions about the coop and the garden and the fence line, and she answered them plainly. And he listened in the way a person listens when they are genuinely revising what they thought they understood. After supper, he sat on the step and looked at the yard going dark, and she washed the plates and set them to dry. And from the doorway she could see the back of him, still and quiet, taking it in. The hens settled in the coop. The garden smelled of turned earth and new growth and the particular green smell of bean leaves in June. She put out the lamp and the yard went dark and still. She had known this land would be difficult. She had walked it in October cold and looked at the poor fence and the tilting coop and the exhausted soil, and she had understood exactly what she was looking at. She had not hoped it would be easy. She had only decided quietly and, without announcing it to anyone, what she intended it to become. And here it was.